Welcome to episode 7 of the Backseat Fighter podcast. I'm Charlie Binns, I'm your host. But before we get into anything, please subscribe and comment when you have subscribed, because this week I'm going to be replying to all of your comments about the amazing debates and topics we have on today's show, which are first, illegal strikes, specifically talking about Michael Chandler's back of the head shots against Charles Oliviera in their co-main event at UFC 309. A little bit of controversy, especially with Michael Chandler's reactions. Then I'm going to be talking about the reactions to the Your Casual debate of episode 6's debate, where I got a lot of reactions in the TikTok comments about the term casual and people calling each other casuals in MMA debates. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And of course, as we love to do on this show, on this podcast, another humanizing athletes debate, especially with Khamzat Chimaev being more open about his health issues in recent months and years. But let's get straight into the topics today. After UFC 309, obviously an amazing event, especially since it was here in New York City. I was able to meet such legendary fighters. I did meet Michael Chandler, actually, who is the focus of this debate today. And obviously that co-main event was special. I mean, a 5-round war, always an entertaining fight when Michael Chandler is there. And obviously Charles Oliviera, the former lightweight champion, one of the best fighters we've ever seen in the octagon, comes out on top with the decision victory. In that fight, obviously we spoke about it before last week, that 5th round, Michael Chandler comes out and almost gets the comeback victory against Charles Oliveira there. But how did he get that? Obviously lands great shots and is able to kind of wobble Charles Oliveira, get him in a vulnerable state. And the ground and pound is where we've really got to focus in here, because it's, for me, it's an undeniable fact at this point that Michael Chandler landed many shots at the back of the head of Charles Oliveira. And on this show, we love to talk about fighter health. I need to talk about the risks and consequences of fighting. And for Charles Oliveira to take, maybe I would say 7 unanswered shots to the back of the head and still be able to get up there and win the fight. Obviously, in that moment, Charles Oliveira was able to recover. He was able to go on and win the fight. He got the result he wanted. It didn't end up affecting the immediate future of Charles Oliveira in that sense. But referee Keith Peterson, he is watching those shots land to the back of the head of Charles Oliveira and doesn't seem to step in. Now, a lot of fans were talking about this online. I mean, even most media shows are picking it up. I'm talking about it right now because it is a big deal, right? Back of the head shots are very, very deadly, very aggressive. And I don't want to say deadly, and I'm going to be careful with that term. I don't want to mean necessarily fatal in terms of the literal definition of killing someone. But, if you hit someone at the back of the head, that is the most vulnerable part of the head to receive contact in. That's why it is illegal in the unified rules of mixed martial arts. However, in that moment, Keith Peterson doesn't jump in. So you're starting to think, well, what are the actual rules? When Ariel Helwani on his show, great job by Ariel Helwani to ask this question to Michael Chandler responded with the unified rules, saying that there is a 1-inch or 2-inch variable on either side of the middle part of the back of the head. So that there's basically a line down the back of the head that's considered the back of the head, and you can't strike within that area. But if you kind of go near to the ear or clip the ear, then it doesn't count. For me, this kind of opened up a wider debate about Michael Chandler as a fighter in terms of not his entertainment, not his ability, not his world championship prospects, not his skill, not his technique, nothing to do with that, but kind of this label and this reputation that he's developing as a dirty fighter, quote unquote. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, but, there were allegations by fighters who he fought in Bellator. I saw one, I forget his name. I apologize. I should know better. After that Dustin Poirier fight, I believe also in MSG, Dustin Poirier called him out for, fish hooking, which is when you put a finger in the mouth of the opponent and pull to advance your position. And, fence grabbing and glove grabbing, getting under the cuff of the glove and pulling that to also advance your position. So these allegations have kind of circled around Michael Chandler already. But in this Charles Oliveira fight, there were many examples. And shout out to the Weasel. He has a great YouTube channel covering MMA and analyzing things like this. And he kind of went through the multiple violations that we saw in that fight from Michael Chandler, from, holding the top of the fence when Charles Oliveira was attempting takedowns and trips, which was able to stop that and keep them on the feet. The glove grabbing, and of course these back of the head shots. This is an important debate, and I hope you guys understand why I'm starting episode 7 of the Backseat Fighter podcast with this topic, because fighter health is paramount. In an age where MMA is finally developing into what I would consider a big sport, a national and international sport, and especially the UFC as a brand has become so prominent, big, and influential, these are the conversations that need to improve, because the sport is old enough now where we're seeing legends of the past like, Shane Carwin and a lot of other people, Mark Hunt, when he talks about the damages that he received. We've seen what Michael Bisping has gone through with the losing the eye. Now he's got these neck problems, and we're wishing Michael Bisping all the best over here at the Backseat Fighter, because those are a lot of the sacrifices they make. But what we're talking about here is brain health. And so with past legends developing things like CTE and brain damage and now are struggling to get on with their day to day, it's times like these where referees have a bigger responsibility to protect fighters, because being a referee is not about trying to be too involved in the fight. I understand that, especially a fight of this magnitude. You don't want Keith Peterson jumping in there necessarily, stopping the fight for some reason. Let's say he lets those things go and he stops the fight, and now Michael Chandler's won and Charles Oliveira's really hurt. Or you don't want him interrupting the flow of that fight for the pure entertainment factor, because it is such a high stakes fight. But the referee's number one responsibility in an octagon, in a cage, whether that's in the UFC, Bellator, PFL, Lux, Fusion Fighting Championship, Cage Warriors, anywhere, any of these things, referee's number one responsibility is to protect the fighters inside the octagon. Because when you're talking about back of the head shots, 10, 20 in a row, yeah, Charles Oliveira is a monster. He's going to keep on going. But how is that going to affect Charles in 10, 20 years? Because what we're learning now is, and what we've learned over the last couple of years as an MMA community, as in science, as it develops, and I'm sure in the coming episodes, we've got a surprise for you guys, because I'm talking to people who work with this stuff in terms of training and brain health. What does that look like in 20 years for Charles Oliveira, in 10 years when he's retired? Do those same shots, were those the ones that caused the damage? And I think referees have to be way more attentive. And if Keith Peterson could come out, and I'm not sure if he has, please in the comments, and I'll reply, of course, if you find any statement by Keith Peterson on why he didn't necessarily tell Michael Chandler to stop doing those shots, and whether or not he actually didn't hit him in the back of the head and Michael Chandler was correct in saying that he was hitting him just behind the ear, please let me know. But these are the type of things that are important on this channel, because you can't take unanswered shots like that. And look, if you're Michael Chandler, this is a big point I wanted to talk about as well. This is not about villainizing Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler was in a fight for his life in the 5th round. He's already fought for 20 minutes and he's lost every single round, been dominated. And he finally had Charles Oliveira hurt. This was his ticket to a number one contender fight or a title shot, was beating Charles Oliveira. And in that moment, I'm sure he's not thinking about, well, I'm not allowed to do this and I'm not allowed to grab this and no, he's thinking about winning that fight, trying to kill another man who's trying to kill him. Because when you're talking about MMA, yeah, we can talk about the intricacies of the rule sets, but at the end of the day, it's two men or women going in there to try and really hurt one another for everything, because it's for all the marbles. It's for everything. And when you win in MMA, you really win. And when you lose, it's the lowest of the lows. So I'm not necessarily demonizing Michael Chandler. At the end of the day, he's got to do everything he can in that moment to try and get out of there with a win. And similarly to the first fight they had, he almost had him out of there, almost had Charles Oliveira out of there. But again, Charles rises to the occasion and is able to get out of there with a win. But it's not necessarily on Michael Chandler, although if you want to go down a sportsmanship debate, maybe as fighters, it's also on them to protect each other and not do things that would kind of be considered illegal or damaging or with bad intent, right? But yes, that comes down again to a bigger debate that's been in MMA for the years and years and years, is whether or not, or the standard of refereeing, right? Does Keith Peterson need to do a better job in that situation? I wholeheartedly believe so, because it's not just about the result of the fight on the night at MSG at UFC 309 or November 17th or whatever it was, right? It's about protecting Charles Oliveira in that situation from himself or from basically from himself, because he's tough. He's going to stay in there. And also from Michael Chandler, who's delivering the illegal shots. So the Keith Peterson has to probably admit that that was a mistake. And I know a lot of the referees from listening to the Believe You Me podcast, they do reflect and they do always ask for advice from other pro fighters or ex-fighters about what is the best way in situations to conduct themselves and whether or not to get involved. I think refereeing has slightly changed in the last couple of months. I know that I would say they're a bit more inclined to separate fighters in terms of, not necessarily entertaining or active grappling situations against the fence. But in that, I think, maybe from a little bit of backlash, maybe people saying that they're too involved in the fights these days, maybe that was playing into Keith Peterson's mindset of him not wanting to kind of get involved and see that position broken up just because of the back of the head shots. But, that this is to mention, like, there's a difference between, I think, Michael Chandler in that moment going for the back of the head shots when he's, at the end of the fight, with everything on the line, and he knows if he loses that it's going to set him back in terms of his own plans for 2025, which was, I believe, to fight Conor McGregor in March and then go on and fight Islam Makhachev for the title. He's thinking in that moment, maybe not, super consciously at the top of his mind, but, he's understanding that this is everything. So he's going to go for that moment, and whatever it takes to get Charles Oliveira out of there is different to a Luana Pinheiro, Gillian Robertson situation where recently Luana Pinheiro came out and said that basically Gillian Robertson was using the newly instated 12-6 elbows, the formerly illegal 12-6 elbows on her glutes and tailbone, just to kind of hurt her and with menace and malintent to kind of just injure her at the end of the fight, because the fight, I think, was in the last round. It was almost over, and now Luana Pinheiro is still feeling the effects of those so-called dirty tactics. So Luana Pinheiro is not very too big of a fan of Gillian Robertson at the moment for using techniques that were kind of just intended to cause pain and not necessarily win the fight. I think there is a difference between what Michael Chandler did at the very end of that fight to try and get out of there with a win and, some dirty tactics. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know what Joe Rogan thinks of this or the kind of the bigger figures in MMA, but like Joe Rogan, there are some purists who would believe, back of the headshot should be legal. There's people who think soccer kicks should be legal. There's people who love the knee stomp that, Khalil Roundtree uses, or John Jones uses, or I believe Robert Whittaker used. I remember Robert Whittaker landed on Darren Till with that and absolutely took his knee out completely. And some people think, maybe that technique should be illegal. But at the end of the day, for a lot of us, MMA is the closest thing to pure fighting. It's the closest thing that we have to pure 1v1 truth. It's about it's the highest form of truth you'll find in sports, because it's not just about a game. It's not about a ball going through a hoop or a ball going to the back of the net and you're down 3 points on a league table and you've got to play on Friday and recover and play a cup game on Sunday. Trust me, I love football, big Arsenal fan, and I love watching football and I love basketball. But the reason I'm in love with MMA and why it's the best sport in the world is because the consequences are higher. And with the consequences being higher, do we want it to be as real and as close as possible to true fighting? Of course we want that, because that's the point of MMA. That's why it's different to boxing and different to kickboxing and different to Muay Thai, is that it tries to incorporate everything so that we can truly see the best style of fighting and what's most dominant and who can bring it all together to be the best fighter, right? But at the end of the day, just circling back, we do have a rule set in the UFC, and that goes into game planning, that goes into strategy, that goes into training certain positions in the gym over fight week that you're protected in. So Charles Oliveira, I'm sure, he's got in that moment, he's expecting shots to the side of the head. He's expecting, maybe threats to the body, or for Michael Chandler to dig in some hooks and try and go for a choke or get his back or something else then repeated shots to the back of the head. And, you know, with the new unified rules being slightly changed with 12 to 6 elbows and the definition of a downed opponent changing, I think there's a lot of things that fighters who have been in the game for a long time, who've been in the UFC for a long time, they're probably thinking, I've got to change some habits here because positions that I thought were safe before are no longer safe. And that does give growth for the sport because it allows people to develop new techniques in terms of offensively now using the 12 to 6 elbow, maybe using knees when an opponent who would have been formerly grounded is now there available to be kneed in the head. So there are developments, but at the end of the day, if there is something that's still illegal, the referee needs to be the one to protect them there. And I'm sure Keith Peterson is thinking about that. It reminds me of that Aljamain Peter Yan first fight for the title where I think Aljo was considered a grounded opponent. Peter Yan throws that knee. And of course, in that moment, I believe it was Herb Dean. Somebody fact checked me on that. You know, he stepped in and did the right thing and stopped the fight when Aljo couldn't continue. For Keith Peterson, what does he do if he stops that fight? Was he afraid that if he stopped that fight, that, you know, in the later rounds that Charles Oliviera would not be able to continue? And, you know, he was thinking, let me just kind of buy my time because it is almost over, the fight. So I don't know what was going through his head, but that's a big debate. And I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think Michael Chandler should have faced any punishment? Do you think Keith Peterson should have jumped in? And do you think, most importantly, those were shots to the back of the head? Now, moving into the second topic of this episode, I'm very excited to get into this. The reactions to the "you're a casual" debate in episode 6 of the Backseat Fighter. Now, you know, on the YouTube, on the podcast, I love to talk about how we can help grow MMA communication, media, and dialogue between fans, because at the end of the day, this sport is for the people. This sport is the most universally identifiable, entertaining sport, in my opinion, in the world, because as Dana White puts it, everybody understands what fighting is. Maybe people don't understand what the rules are, what the techniques necessarily are on the ground, or what an off-rhythm striking matchup looks like, or you know, how, let me phrase that better, how Izzy uses offbeat striking to time his opponents, and maybe how Alex Pereira deceives his opponents with his leg kick and doesn't telegraph with the hip movement. You know, the small intricacies like that people may not understand, but people know punch each other in the face and knockouts. So that's what makes this sport so special. But what's happened now is that as the UFC has grown, as people have become more knowledgeable about it, as it's become a mainstream sport, which we can all be very happy about, you know, it's kind of developed that people think that because they're more knowledgeable about other people, that they can call each other casuals. So this is what we spoke about in the episode 6 and in my TikTok post that I put out. And in that TikTok post, the comments went to absolute war with each other. It all started with a simple Chael Sonnen is the GOAT joke. And I don't know whether it got misinterpreted or what, but it started a chain reaction of people then doing the exact thing I was saying needed to change. Because the term casual, it's a funny term, and it could be used, I believe, in an ironic way. It should be used as a joke, and it still has its place in terms of MMA dialogue, especially in casual settings. See what I did there? But, you know, it should be used between friends and family when you're watching it. It can be. Not should be, but it can be, right? But especially online and on like official platforms like mine, I don't think it has a place, because calling somebody a casual just for not understanding something or disagreeing with you is just not productive for any of us. We need to be kind of informing each other, especially if we want this sport to grow, because there is so much more potential for MMA to become a bigger sport, and it's already on the rise. I think now you look back where the UFC was so dependent on stars like Conor McGregor or Brock Lesnar or Chuck Liddell. I mean, these guys built the UFC and laid the foundations for what we have now in terms of a fan base, in terms of media. But the UFC doesn't necessarily depend on the huge stars of the game anymore. So to see where the UFC is, to see that they've got these huge TV deals and they're in negotiations right now, it gives us as fans, as media, an opportunity to really develop into a professional space. The same way people talk about football and basketball, how informed the fans actually are, and especially in terms of like American football and soccer and what I would call football. Fans are educated. Fans know tactics. Fans often know who that player is if he's obscure and he came from this academy. And we're getting to a point now in MMA where we're starting to understand, these are the best gyms, right? The fans know which is a good MMA gym. They know where that, for example, that Rosas Jr. has his own team in San Diego, or Santa Rosa, my bad. Or that, there's Team Alpha Male where, when Uriah Faber was coming up with TJ Dillashaw and Cody Garbrandt, they know that team started over there and they've gone their different ways. They know that, Extreme Couture is where Sean, they know the gyms, right? So fans are becoming more informed, and I think it's our job as media, especially my job. And, I want people in my comments to be helping each other and having good discussions. And that doesn't mean not disagreeing with each other, but it does mean not necessarily jumping on people to prove that you know better than them or that you have more experience than each other. No, if somebody has a good point or you disagree with them and they have a bad point, tell them why, but in a manner that helps them reflect, because we can't just be using the label "you're a casual" so frivolously and so casually in that way. I think it doesn't have a space or a place necessarily in MMA anymore, especially if you want the sport to grow. Now, do I love the engagement on the TikTok? Yes, I do. And I can't wait to see you guys' comments on this episode because I will be replying to all of them. And especially on that debate, I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that calling someone a casual still has a place in MMA? And do you think it's a force for good in that sense? Or do you think it needs to be excommunicated from our vocabulary as people within the MMA sphere and combat sphere? Please let me know. But I'm leaning right now that it needs to go and we need to get better as a community in that sense. Now, the last topic of the episode, I know that we've kind of gone through these topics because we don't have fights this past weekend, or we didn't have fights this weekend for the UFC. And I wanted to take this time to kind of talk about more, conceptual things like the casual debate, like the illegal shots debate. But the last topic is about humanizing fighters once again. Now, this is what the channel and the podcast has been absolutely built off. In the first episode, this was the discussion of the week. It was about humanizing these athletes, these UFC fighters, these warriors, these men and women that put on absolute shows for us and, leave a piece of themselves in the octagon for our entertainment. I mean, I think the person who, really set that in stone for me in the modern era was Dustin the Diamond Poirier. I remember him going on Ariel Helwani and saying, I don't know how many more I have left, in reference to his retirement coming up soon. And that he really was going into super insightful detail about the way a fighter mentality works, especially for someone like him at the end of his career, who's still elite in the game, right? But he knows that he's taken a lot of damage. He knows that he's probably not getting another title shot after his third attempt. And at the end of the day, he said, every time I go in there, I know I'm leaving a piece of myself in there and I know I'm not getting it back. And I have to think about that in terms of my family. I want to be able to spend time with my daughter. I want to be able to spend time with my wife. And there's kind of that paradox that we're talking about when it comes to fighters, is the fact that, in order to get ready for a fight, you've got to put yourself in a hyper selfish, hyper individualized, and kind of a hyper isolated space, because you're going off to training camp, for the next 8 to 12 weeks, 6 to 12 weeks, maybe more than that you're in a space where you're totally focused on war and you're focused on training, eating well, recovery. And that's it if you're doing it right, and in fighting, dedicate that time away from your family each time you have a fight, to then in one day, in the hopes of one day kind of being able to get that time back and spend it with your family after all the hard work you put in for that money, for that life that you built for your family. It starts to become a question of, am I still going to be able to provide for them doing this and still get the time after and the quality time after? Maybe not if I keep going. And I think that's what Dustin Poirier has started to grapple with. pardon the pun, in terms of, his career and taking the damage. So I just wanted to mention that little Dustin Poirier part because that comes into the question, the bigger, broader purpose of this podcast to talk about, what are these fighters sacrificing? They're literally leaving parts of themselves that they can never get back, especially the way Dustin Poirier fights. He's an absolute beast. I think of that Dan Hooker fight when probably the most damage I've seen Dustin Poirier take in a fight, and both of them went to absolute war, and I'm sure both of them believe that. They've never necessarily been entirely the same after that because they went, 5 rounds of just absolutely smashing the Jesus out of each other. But that leads me to come to what's come out recently with Khamzat Chimaev again. Now, in episode 1 of the Backseat Fighter podcast, I spoke about Khamzat Chimaev because I believe it was his fight coming up, or I just really thought that he was relevant in this discussion because he's a fighter who is probably the most dominant fighter in the world in terms of his style, his grappling ability, his ability to wrestle people to the ground, to shoot across the cage and get you down and submit you so quickly. I mean, we see what he did to Robert Whittaker. We originally believed that he broke Robert Whittaker's jaw with just pure power, but we've now found out that Robert Whittaker had a cyst under his teeth that would make them, that made them very weak and vulnerable, and that he wasn't even able to eat like an apple since he was like, a young kid. So we know that Khamzat Chimaev actually has come out and spoken even more recently about the health issues that he was having. And it wasn't just about the fact that his kid has been sick or that he himself has had to cancel bouts because of illnesses. He spoke of that he had half of his thyroid gland removed. Now that is such a big deal because your thyroid gland has a lot to do with your immune system. And I believe, it reduces your immunity a lot. And so when you think about how many times on Twitter you've seen people saying, oh, this guy Khamzat is a pull-out merchant, or even in general with fighters, like, oh, he's pulled out again, like, oh, he's always injured this guy. And that goes for general sports and athletes all over the world in all of their disciplines. People are so quick to jump on them for being, oh, this guy can never stay healthy, he's never available, oh, this fighter always pulls out from fights, he can never make weight. Well, you're talking about real health, real biological issues that Khamzat Chimaev is facing. And he kind of spoke about it like, it doesn't affect me too much, but, the facts are that he does struggle with his health. And I think for him, there's a slight dilemma because he trained so hard and he said, I'm always in the gym, I train way too hard, and that's why I get sick so much, is because I'm just pedal to the metal the whole entire time. But then isn't that, and he's like, I don't think, it's a good idea to train that way. So I'm sure he's changed that up a little bit. But at the same time, that's how he developed into the most dominant wrestler that I've seen in a long time, maybe since Khabib. But, it's an amazing ability that Khamzat Chimaev has shown to come back from these setbacks. And, for us as fans, for us as media, it's so important to keep humanizing these fighters. We don't know what they're going through. And so often we do get, so often we don't know what the fighters are going through. Even in a win or a loss, they're not going to come out and tell you, well, yeah, I didn't even have an ACL. Like I tore my ACL 2 weeks out and I still walked in here and tried to put on a show. Charles Oliviera came into that fight against Michael Chandler with knee injuries. Michael Bisping was fighting with one eye forever. He sacrificed an eye for this game and was able to win a world title. I remember Conor McGregor obviously tore his ACL, I think, before that Chad Mendes fight. And there's so many examples of what it takes on the toll it takes on the body for fighters to even get in there. But I think it's just so important at the end of the day, humanize these fighters, understand what they're going through. And that kind of wraps to the first discussion we had about the illegal shots, right? Humanize these athletes, humanize Charles Oliveira in that moment, look, they're already putting it all on the line. Charles Oliveira is already putting everything on the line. He's coming into that fight injured. He knows that if I win this fight, I get a title shot again. And if I don't, maybe I'm out of the picture for a long time, Charles Oliveira is, still pretty much in his prime. I think he's about 34, 35 years old. But he doesn't have too much time left in this game. And he needs, if he wants to do another successful title run and maybe a defense, he needs to get that going now. So for him in that moment, you have to imagine on a human level, like taking that many shots to the back of the head, he's probably concerned about that in some way. At least his team may be looking at it like, yo, ref, help me, step in there. And, you know, when you look at it, like the damage that Charles Oliviera has taken throughout his career is a lot. Let's just be frank. You know, he's a legend. He's probably my first, second, third favorite UFC fighter of all time. But he has taken a lot of damage. He's been dropped, you know, in that first fight with Michael Chandler. He was dropped by Dustin Poirier. He was dropped by Justin Gaethje. He was dropped, I believe, or rocked at least by Islam Makhachev. Like, he's a warrior and he doesn't need extra damage. And, you know, with Khamzat Chimaev coming back and all these storylines that I'm more attentive to, in terms of even Luana Pinheiro talking about the fact that she can't even sit down and she can't even go around her daily activities after a fight with Gillian Robertson. Michael Chandler coming out of this Charles Oliveira fight shows off the swelling in his leg that's come from a knee injury. I believe he tore his MCL early in the fight. You know, these fighters really sacrifice everything, and the injuries that they not only get in the fights, but through training camps and sparring and all of these other things. You know, we tend not to think of that as normal people going about our business, especially as consumers of the sport. We kind of like to think of them as superheroes, that they're on TV and they're not real. But for me, even just kind of meeting Corey Sandhagen in Central Park, or meeting Michael Chandler at the Hard Rock Cafe, or meeting Gilbert Nuno Burns and Diego Lopez at Renzo Gracie, they are just normal guys they are normal guys with a special mentality and a special part of their brain that makes them fighters, who make them different from us. And of course, I respect them so much. But that doesn't mean they're not human, right? They're special, but they're not. But they are special, but at the same time, they are still human. And I think a lot of our discourse needs to come back to that. I wanted to mention just a few more things. I want everybody to be commenting in the comments this time, because I will be replying, and that goes for all of the platforms, but especially the YouTube. I'm going to be uploading the podcast to Spotify from now on, so watch out for that. I know from audio listeners who prefer just listen to their podcasts on audio without the visual, I need to provide you with some content on other platforms, because YouTube, I don't believe you can play without having on. I do want to do a giveaway soon for Christmas. I'm going to be making some Backseat Fighter hoodies, embroidered hoodies and hats. So when that happens, I will be letting you all know, and I'll be doing a little giveaway contest, and I'll let you know how that works, how you can enter that and win some of the prizes. But also, I just wanted to mention very quickly, you know, this purpose of this podcast is obviously to uplift fighters, to talk about the sacrifices they make, to talk about the consequences of winning and losing, to talk about brain health, damage, to talk about the unique nature of fighters, how important it is that they exist in our society. Why do we love this game? But it's also to offer a more analytical approach to MMA coverage and to sports coverage in general. I think, you know, just to finish off this episode, you know, in mainstream sports media, whether that be covering the NBA, whether that be covering NFL, you know, the Premier League, the La Liga, football, you know, anything, right? So often we're quick to jump on people and, you know, he's a bum, he's washed up. You know, he didn't play well because he only went 3 for 10, or he didn't fight well because he did this, because he took too many shots this way. That's so broad, so black and white, that I get it. For the normal person who's got a really busy schedule, it seems that they don't have time to kind of go through an analytical process. I disagree. I think we're all, especially for things we're interested in, you know, for sports, I think we're all smart people. I think we all have the ability to grasp concepts, whether that be in fighting or anything else. And I just want this podcast and this show and my channel and this community to be a place where we don't gatekeep knowledge from each other, where we can develop the ideas of, you know, what exactly is he doing in a fight to win it, and analyze it through a professional lens. Right. And, you know, that's why I'm getting fighters on to talk about these things. That's why I'm getting professionals to talk about brain health, because I don't have all of that. And that's why I am the backseat fighter. That's why I am talking about these things and understanding what my position is, where my perspective comes from, is not that of somebody in the gym every day on a professional level, right? That's not me as part of a team, as part of a training team that's, traveling to the UFC with a fighter or, things like that. But I do believe that I want to lead a space where all of people can kind of contribute and develop knowledge with one another, and we can change the landscape of sports media. And we don't have to just talk in broad terms of he's washed up, he's a bum, he's not clutch. Like things like these, like the clutch gene and things like that. Like these are casual conversations that are definitely have their place, the barbershop talk. And even sometimes on this podcast, that will happen, perhaps. But I'm going to try my best to be a force for a new wave of sports media where we actually talk about real stuff and not just go based on pure narratives. That's why when I'm exploring this Michael Chandler to the back of the head shots, I'm not just writing him off as a dirty fighter, because I could just put that as, Michael Chandler is a dirty fighter, full stop, right? No, it's a question that people have asked, and I've gone, well, these are some techniques that I believe that he used in the fight that weren't necessarily correct to use. But I understand why he used them. And maybe he wasn't thinking in that moment because of the context of which he was fighting, and I don't think he's necessarily a dirty fighter by intention. These are the levels of analysis that we have to get into, not just on technique and whatever, but context. What's the context of his career in that moment? Where is he on the night? He's at MSG at the co-main event, the amount of adrenaline. He's about to do a comeback against Charles Oliviera after losing 4 rounds. These are the things that you have to speak about on a human level. How do these come into sport? Because sport is so often spoken about on ESPN and Sky News and Sky Sports, about, as something that's kind of exists in its own conceptual realm where it's completely devoid of reality. And the idea that, these fighters don't exist in the real world, that they're just on TV and exist for our pleasure and entertainment. And after that, it all just fizzles away and that they're not real and we go back to our normal lives. No, we've got to speak about this in reality, ground our ideas and our discussions in reality, and, make sure we're not just feeding into narratives without any sort of basis, research or analysis at all. But that's going to be it for episode 7 of the Backseat Fighter podcast. I know it was a bit more of a conceptual discussion-based episode, but I really enjoyed it. And I know for a week with no fights, I really enjoyed having the time to just talk about some important things that I think are going on in the UFC, MMA, combat sports space. Please subscribe to the Backseat Fighter on YouTube and comment when you have done so. I'll be replying to all of those comments. There'll be a giveaway soon. If people are interested, let me know, for embroidered hoodies and hats with the logo, and everything's going to look nice. And of course, I'll be uploading the episodes on Spotify shortly for all the people that need audio episodes only. Thank you so much for watching, and go follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and keep up with all the content. I'll see you next time for episode 8 of the Backseat Fighter.